Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming on this Saturday morning to the National Museum of Qatar. My name is Jelena Trkulja, and on behalf of Qatar Creates team, I welcome you to the two panels that we have organized today. So we will begin with Global Voices in Contemporary Art panel at 9, followed by the Heritage and Jewelry Houses at 10. But I would like to start with welcoming the first panel and the moderator, Tom Eccles, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, who will introduce his panel. And, well, take it away, Tom.
Okay, thank you. And really thank you all for getting up a little earlier this morning to come to this panel. It's a great panel. It's Voices in Contemporary Art, Navigating Local and Global Context. And the brief was given to me by Dr. Zeina, who I'm very grateful to having been invited to moderate this. We've got could probably not have a better panel for this topic. We have Ulrich Obrist in the middle here, director of the Serpentine Gallery, global curator, globe-trotting curator is often called. What's often forgotten with Hans is how he's dedicated so much of his time to travel the world to actually discover and then promote and elevate voices from around the globe, really actually beginning with me about 40 years ago, 35 years ago in Scotland. He came to Glasgow, which was what we would call nowhere at the time, and really helped launch a lot of careers from the Glasgow art scene. So I'm always grateful to Hans for that, and it's often forgotten. Wael Shawky, an Egyptian artist who was subject to a Mataf exhibition here in 2015, and is now working very closely with Qatar Museums on developing a new education program here, which he'll talk about a little later, or that'll definitely come up in the conversation. And of course, triumphant from his return from the Venice Biennale, where he represented Egypt, and was really one of those moments when you walk around Venice and everyone says, you know, have you seen anything good? And everybody said, you've got to see Egypt this year. Zeina Arida is director of Mataf, formerly director of Sursok Museum in Beirut, and also the previous director of the Arab Image Foundation. Very grateful for Zeina to come at this last notice game-changing time. She's currently finishing up the installation of Seeing is Believing, the Art of Jerome, and a collaborative project with the Lusail Museum, formerly known as the Orientalist Museum. I think that will provide an interesting kind of point of conversation as to, you know, presenting an artist who creates a world image of another part of the world historically, and how does one critically examine that. And to my right, Rashid Johnson, much acclaimed artist, painter, sculptor, filmmaker from New York, probably one of the most important artists of his generation. And I think we'll touch down on what's changed in some ways in America in the last 2 years in terms of thinking about the local and the global. Rashid has created absolutely astonishingly beautiful work in Airport Park, which is near here. So I'm hoping many of you will come to the launch of that project. It's called Village of the Sun, and it's an enormous, beautiful, multifaceted mosaic work that creates a new public space in Qatar. So let me start. The panel is going to explore the interplay between local cultural influences and global trends in the world of contemporary art. No one better to start with than Ulrich Obrist, probably known best for his, or certainly known for his prodigious interviews. So I thought I would start the interview with a question that Hans actually pushed in front of Bruno Latour, the famous French theoretician. Hans, when Edouard Glissant described this notion of mondalité, he basically said that there are two dangers. One danger is the sort of homogenizing homogenizing forces of globalization that annihilate difference, and there's the danger of retreating into the local, which refuses global dialogue. Does resistance toward today's globalizing forces by necessity lead to a new emphasis on the local?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom, and very excited to be on this panel today. Actually, Edouard Glissant's idea of mondialité really grew out of this idea that he wanted to find a way to, as you said, resist the homogenizing forces of globalization and develop a kind of a new form of the local. But that new form of the local would not be localist. And that's actually, it's interesting because the last conversation we had with Bernard Stiegler when we were at Luma in Arles with you, Tom, and Maya Hoffman. And there was a conversation with Philippe Pareno, the artist, and Bernard Stiegler. The late Bernard Stiegler, in our last conversation, said, you know, comment peut-on être local sans être localiste? No? How can we emphasize this necessity of the local without being localist? And what, of course, he meant by that was a very Glissantian idea, because as Glissant always said, you know, it is about thinking about local roots, but not local roots which exclude other roots. Because obviously the danger Glissant saw early on in this resistance to homogenize, in this necessary resistance to homogenize globalization, is that there could be a kind of a counter-reaction which would be new forms of localisms, new forms of nationalisms, no new forms of lack of tolerance. And that would, of course, lead then to another very major problem. And for that reason, he said, you know, we need basically not roots which overrule or override other roots, but roots which protect, no, roots which shelter, roots which take care of other roots. No? And so that's really the idea of the local as Glissant understood it, and then he defined it as mondialité. Mondialité is a different form of global dialogue. No? It's a local which is open for the global. And of course, the reason why I keep returning to that is that I think it's a fantastic toolbox, no, curatorially on a really daily basis, because I think, you know, obviously the whole world of exhibitions is very much exposed to forces of globalization. And for example, this whole idea, you know, of touring shows, when we basically tour a show from one city to the next, you know, and put it in crates, that's nothing else than homogenized globalization. Whenever I tour a show, and we have the same principle at the Serpentine, is that we listen to the local context, and then the show, when it tours, it evolves, it changes. It's a global tour, but it's also a local tour. And we can even go further, I think, with exhibitions, and think about the exhibitions, you know, which tour in a very different way. So, for example, our project Do It, which we started in 93 with Christian Boltanski and Bertrand Lavier, is a show which is only constituted by recipes and by instructions and how-to manuals. And that means that these instructions, recipes by artists are locally interpreted wherever the show goes. So there isn't even a transport needed anymore. So it's also extremely sustainable, you know, and it's interpreted each time by local artists. But more than that, wherever the show goes, and this show has been touring since 1993 in 171, you know, cities, and it never stopped. So it's been a, you know, more than 30-year kind of journey. And each time the show goes somewhere, we make a local research, translate the instructions, you know, into the local language, but also find artists in the local context who have somehow worked, you know, with instruction art, with how-to manuals. So that's kind of, Do It would be a very direct application. I think, you know, Glissant in that sense, I think, which is why I always believed that, and Latour agreed with me on that in that conversation, you said, you know, that Glissant is one of the most important thinkers of the 21st century, because we can really have him as a daily toolbox. It's also why I read Glissant every morning when I wake up.
Jen, I see you taking some notes. Maybe a response to Hans?
No, I don't have a response, but I've been just, you know, retaining some words because I think they are very much at the heart of what we try to be open to, working in certain contexts, of course, and like when we think about local, which are care, you spoke about tolerance, I would add perspective, which leads us to the exhibition we are doing together with the Lusail. I think this is the only exhibition of like celebrating Jean-Léon Gérôme, as this is the year celebrating his 200th anniversary, that is taking place in a museum in the Arab world. So that's interesting, and I also think that we should think about what constitutes when we speak about global. Actually, what is what is the global? So when we oppose local and global, I mean, is it a perspective that is the like let's say I don't know how to call it, like that really is dictated to the local? Is it about, you know, I don't know. I don't know how we would today in the world in which we are, I don't know how to think about the global. I don't know what is the global actually.
But I know when I was kind of doing a little research for this panel, the mission of MATAF is expanding our global understanding of Arab art and artists in the Arab world. Maybe you could speak to that, the challenges, but also the opportunities. And then also maybe, you know, it's interesting, Jerome's most famous painting is called The Snake Charmer. It's at the Clark in Massachusetts. And it's famous because it was on the cover of Edward Said's Orientalism publication. So every student knows this painting well. It's a rather shocking painting. And I think for me, I was like, wow, that's interesting, doing a Jerome show at MATAF. And that seems to then say, well, that's an expansion of the mission, an expansion of the idea.
Actually, not really, because I mean, we have to think about the way MATHAF's core collection was constituted. So it was collected by Sheikh Hassan Ben Ali Al Thani, who had been, you know, who was very interested in archaeology and then started collecting Orientalist paintings, photographs from the 19th century, and Arab modern art at the same time. And so it's interesting that. You know, when we started discussing about this collaboration with the Lusail, I was of course very interested because I believe that MATHAF's collection has so much is so meaningful in conversation, simply in conversation with other collections, with other institutions, and I think that this is what we also want to bring to MATHAF. But also this is what we want to, let's say, when you spoke about the collection, of course, we want to expand MATHAF's perspective geographically. And of course, we want to circulate much more the collection, but we also want to do it in a certain way. So for us, MATHAF's collection is a very important tool for studying, writing the biographies of the artists, but also like bringing the perspective from within our region where these artists practiced for so long and what was impacting their work, understanding, you know, all their socio-political context in which they were practicing. And at the same time, I'm not sure it's so interesting to take these artists, for instance, to shows where they are compared, right? So of course, this is when we come to global modernism and the role that MATHAF's collection has as well.
And Wael, maybe you could speak a little about navigating the tension between maintaining cultural specificity and participating in a kind of interconnected global art world, cultural world.
I think this is always something I have to refer to, which is my background, my childhood. Because this is really, I believe, is what affected most of what I'm trying to do now in the practice of my art. I lived part of my childhood in Saudi Arabia, and I believe that was in Mecca, actually. So it was always, of course, as a kid, I was always like confronted with this idea of being someone foreigner, but at the same time, I'm an Arab, I'm Muslim, I live in Mecca. I think this is something really, I felt it, I lived it. And that was in the 70s, end of 70s, and that was from my perspective also as a child, it was the time in Saudi where this modernity that it's happening which is this type of American modernity in a society that you feel that it's like really more into tribal, like really completely different system. It's not really the capitalism that we see. And it was not really about a contrast between two different systems, but actually it was more about two systems that they don't really belong to each other, but they live together. And I feel that this idea itself lived with me until I started to make my artwork also about the same thing. Also, always questioning this idea of being the local and the idea of being how can be part of this international modernity that is happening. Yes, and the idea of that it's always questioning me is the transformation in societies, how each society is having this dream of developing somehow from one system to a higher system, from nomadism to urbanism, from nomadism to agricultural society, for example. All these things, I believe it was my motivation always to make art, which is like trying to investigate in this transitional point, basically. And I think that also was, if you want to talk about the education, about the reason, for example, that was also my involvement with art, with education. The idea that my interest to see a society that it's in transition from one system to a higher system, or the dream of this.
Your films are also produced in Arabic, and I thought that was kind of, for me, certainly in Venice and before, kind of one. It's a very conscious decision in this world that, you know, primarily the lingua franca, ironically, is actually English in the art world still. Has that created? That's a conscious decision. So if you could maybe say something about the why and how of that, but has that also created challenges in terms of the distribution of your work at times?
In Arabic, in classical Arabic, it's the language that I know the most and I can control it. And sometimes I try to make something completely against this, which is, for example, I work sometimes with project in language that I don't know at all. Like I made a project before called Dictums, and I made it in Urdu, which is a language that I don't speak. I have a show now in Korea, in Daegu Museum, and I decided also to make a film in Korean, Pansori singing, which is a folkloric type of singing in Korea. Sometimes I do this just to isolate myself a little bit from being too much involved with the text. As I said before, the Arabic, I really know it and I control it the most, and I always attach to the script. I'm attached to the text. Sometimes it's a sacred text, like I make sometimes work with the verses from Quran, for example, and sometimes it's a historical text, and I deal with also with the historical text in a way that it's a sacred. In a way, also, part of me don't believe in this historical text, but it's a way to, when I deal with it in a sacred way, it's a way to not to be cynical, but to allow myself to analyze it more.
Maybe, Rashid, you could talk about Village of the Sun, which both in form and kind of content seems to be very much a modern work. It was commissioned for the World Cup originally. So the World Cup, of course, is the global event, but ironically is also an event in which every nation is pitted against every nation. So the piece was really meant to be a kind of humanist portrait, in a sense, of all the participants of the World Cup. But based on your own work, do you think the work would have a different meaning in the United States, or would you have made the work differently in the United States? Or how did you consider the context of Qatar for the work?
Honestly, what a long, strange trip it's been to bring this work to fruition. But I too would probably have to kind of hark back to my origin story. son of a man from Mississippi and a woman who is Afro-Cuban. I grew up in Chicago. My parents were at earlier stages communists, so I kind of grew up with a different sensibility around my kind of political leanings and understanding. So kind of within the discourse of the kind of idea of the local and the global. My mother was an African history professor, so she had an emphasis on post-colonial feminist theory in West African countries. And so this kind of space of hybridity is really kind of at the heart of my project as a whole and my thinking as a whole. So I've never actually much felt local, which I think is not uncommon amongst Black Americans, but in particular in my case, because of the kind of hybrid space between kind of political identity, sensibility, and origin, it has also been for me kind of a challenging prospect to think about the idea of local or global. And as to whether this sculpture would be different in a different context, that's also complicated for me. One thing that I've always consistently imagined in my project is that the project can travel, and there's a certain kind of rigor and sophistication in the tools that the audience is given agency to, that I think that gives them allowance to interpret it in any space. So I don't really think about a project necessarily evolving from the perspective of where I sit, but I think that it does kind of give a different kind of space to the audience for how they would interpret it in different locations. In particular, this work, for me, feels like a sundial in this space. So when I was able to visit it yesterday, and hopefully you guys get to see the sculpture or the installation after this. But when I was able to visit it yesterday, one of the things that I noticed is that it was very quickly employed by the local population. So apparently it opened, I think, only 2 days ago. And I kind of came upon the sculpture and people were kind of in front of it and participating with it as if it had been there for 20 years. And I wasn't sure if that was a result of a comfort level that they have in the location, in the space, a feeling of ownership in public space, or whether that was the sculpture that kind of motivated that opportunity. And when I talk about it being a sundial, it's these 4 large walls, and as we've all experienced here, the sun is quite the protagonist as far as this landscape is concerned. So there are shadows that are cast by the sculpture. So what you get the opportunity to see is the kind of the folks who participate with it kind of moving alongside it as the day travels. So the shadows will be cast in different spaces, and you see people kind of move their groupings around the sculpture, and that kind of motivates it almost as if it is kind of a literal kind of sundial or a space for respite. I also saw kids kicking balls against the wall. I'm like, the ownership of it was just fascinating. I'm like, this kid is just kicking a ball against it, and I'm standing there looking at him. And he's looking at me like, yeah, this is how I'm going to activate this sculpture. And I guess it's a really interesting question for me to think whether someone else in a different location would take that same ownership, or whether they would be using a different tool or a different resource. This kid was kicking a soccer ball. In America, is that turn into a baseball? In Spain, does that turn into a tennis ball? Who are the people who then are feeling ownership and the opportunity to activate the space? In this particular area where this sculpture has been recited several times. So where it currently is, it's been described to me as more of a, I'm trying to find the language that would be appropriate, but a working class neighborhood. And so the folks who are kind of spending their time around this park are folks who are kind of in between the moment of their labor. And so that idea of this respite between certain kinds of labor and how labor is activated. And in different spaces, there are different kinds of laborers who would then be able to employ these spaces. So the thing for me in a sculpture like this is less the opportunity for a kind of didactic teaching and more the opportunity to kind of learn from the local population as to how they're going to activate, how they're going to employ, and how they're going to take agency around a work.
And one of the criticisms of globalization is, of course, homogenization. And maybe I could move to, I'm not even sure if that's true anymore, actually, but with Wael, establishing a school here, you work between Alexandria, Philadelphia, Dubai, and now Doha. Is there a difference between what you would do here in terms of establishing an academy to what you might do in Philadelphia?
Okay, that's something I will discover. Let's see. But I started a school in Alexandria. That was almost 2010. Well, it's a program that I thought I can just accept up to 30 students a year, and the students have one big space. They don't change really for 1 year. We try to keep the students, and the professors are only visiting professors for 1 year. I think it was incredible for me experience, because I was just saying that part of my motivation is to try to investigate this society in transition and the dream for society to evolve from one level to a higher level. And I was always really surprised. And I'm not just saying this, I was really, really surprised with the results, because most of the people that we accepted in this time in Egypt, they didn't really know anything about art. I'm saying even the students that were already studying at the Faculty of Fine Arts in Alexandria, it was just something really for us incredible to see the possibility of people to grasp all this amount of information in 1 year, and to surprise us in the end. So this is something I really did in Egypt, and I think it succeeded a lot. Now the big question that we always, of course, discuss here, that how can we cannot take the same model and put it here, of course. This is something completely different. And the idea now that my hope that I can find the right model for Fire Station to make it also, I don't want to say a school, but I prefer to call it a platform that I invite also as much discourses as possible in this place, and to develop what we hope that it can be a new art scene in Doha, inshallah. This is really something, but it's still in progress. So I will start this in September 2025.
Then?
Maybe, I think it's important also to think about the need, right? The students in Alexandria you said they learned so much in 1 year, but there was a real need and a real curiosity. And I think that this is, it's also as in the post-war period in Lebanon, when we initiated, all these non-profit and contemporary art platforms, there were gaps and there was a need. So this is how I guess the ecosystem starts to build and to actually create the artists who will be interested, or the students who then will also be given platforms in other institutions here to practice, to be invited to do an exhibition, a public art commission.
Sorry, just to add something. I don't know but it's the thing that also we're still discussing, that Fire Station is already a residency program, and my wish is to try to change this idea of the residency program a little bit. So yeah,
yeah, but it's also like any museum today, right? You want to make it more engaging. You want to make it more engaging for those who are part of it, but also for those who come. So then this is how, how do you transform it into, for instance, it reminds me what you said about your sculpture. What you described is that the sculpture and the shadow is creating a public space. So public space, meaning a place where people will meet without having, you know, given like each other meeting point, or and I think this is what is very perhaps this is the challenge, right? How do you make the program engaging?
Yeah, but it takes time. I mean, I think also in Egypt we developed. I mean, the first year is not like the second year. We learn from the program, and yes, let's see how this will work.
Maybe I could have a question that starts with Hans and goes to Rashid, which is, you know, we've seen certainly over the last 20 years a complete evolution of the international art world. And part of it is driven by museums and curators, but a lot of it's also driven by the market, and the art market it is much closer. The proximity of the art market and the curatorial world and the international art scene are very different today than they were 20 years ago, but something both of you experienced very closely. And could you speak a little bit about that transition and what perhaps are the resistances to it, but what are the gains in this? Is everything engaged with globalization a bad thing? And also, as a curator, in your case, Hans, how has the notion of creating dialogue changed in the last 2 decades?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think that's such a kind of essential, such an important question. And I think in a way, we have, of course, through, you know, an increased global dialogue, a much more polyphonic art world. And when you and I, you know, entered, when we met at the very beginning of the 90s, you know, we had this belief always that there needs to be many centers, there needs to be a polyphony, and that is something which has certainly increased. But I think one of the things we can see now change, and I think it's always super interesting to listen to artists, you know, and to basically, out of conversation with artists, see where institutions have to go. No, it should be that way and not the other way around. Because I think, I mean, that's really what I learned from the Italian artist Alighiero Boetti. He said, you know, we shouldn't squeeze artist practice into institutional formats, but we need to think how the institutions can evolve according to where art goes. And what we can see right now is, yes, the importance of a global dialogue, but also artists thinking about longer durational formats. You know, I think this idea, I mean, while talking about the school, you know, that's one example. Many artists right now are interested in this idea of setting up, you know, models of schools, and that's a longer durational project. That's not the framework of an exhibition. That's not the framework, you know, of an event. And I think that we can see that also at the moment, when we invite artists to do projects, very often the artist would rather do a garden, and not only metaphorically, but also real, than an exhibition. We have at the moment many artists who work with farming projects. We just had a show at the Serpentine of Inca Shonibare, you know, and Inca Shonibare's main project is that he reconnected to Nigeria and basically develops there a residency and an environmental farm. That's a very long durational project. And, you know, so we were thinking, how can we bring that into the context of an exhibition? Another example is the show we have right now in London of Lauren Halsey. Lauren Halsey is an amazing young artist who is a social sculptor, and she started a social sculpture, which is basically, it's called Summer of Everything, which really has to do with her engaging deeply with the local community in South Central LA. And in a way, what is so fascinating is that when she does exhibitions, because she continues to do exhibitions in order to actually have that global dialogue, but she then brings it back into the local community. So many of you will have seen the project she did at the Met, no, on the roof of the Metropolitan Museum. That project now, for her, that was very, very important, is going back to her city, to her neighborhood. And we had the same kind of discussions, of course, you know, with the exhibition of London. So I think in a way, these are different negotiations which are very fascinating, and they have all to do in a way right now with, the French historian Fernand Braudel called it la longue durée, you know, with things which have to do more with long duration. And I think we need to think, you know, as institutions, how we can answer that and support that.
No, I'm glad that Hans brought up Lauren Halsey, who's an artist who I've been supportive of. But I start my journey as an artist in the mid-90s, and it's at a time when you don't necessarily see the market as such an effective tool necessarily. I mean, I assumed at one stage that I would probably try to get a teaching job, and ideally maybe I would get a Guggenheim Fellowship, and I think at the time they gave you $60,000, and that would have been an enormous amount of money. I think what we're seeing with artists today, artists who I enjoy the practices of, who are forced to have to navigate the complexity of the market and all of the kind of fraught nature of what comes with it, is trying to use it more resourcefully. I think initially when you first see all of these resources kind of come into the space, artists are then kind of trying to figure out how it's going to necessarily affect our projects and our practices. But what I've seen more recently, and I think there are several artists who are examples of this, and I try in my own way to be an example of this, is kind of recognizing the resource and then figuring out how to pivot those resources into things that we're more excited about and more interested in. So beyond the actual kind of distribution and transaction, what I often try to do, and I'm working on an exhibition currently, which is a mid-career survey of my work at the Guggenheim Museum, but one of the things that accompanies this exhibition is an invitation. And that invitation is really quite ambitious in that I'm aspiring to bring every 13-year-old, for instance, into the museum. So trying to establish opportunities for busing. When that invitation happens, how are they received? Are we feeding people? Are we bringing in people who speak a similar vernacular to the people who we're excited to bring in? And not only are we inviting and bringing these folks into the institution, but we are trying to use these folks as a resource, because if we're really going to invest in culture, what we have to recognize is that we need to go as far out into the tentacles of spaces of people who have been more often disenfranchised in cultural institutions, because we need to recruit them, not unlike bankers recruit kids who are good at math. We need every angle of culture to be investigated, and we need to make sure that we're bringing these folks in to participate and to engage. In order to kind of facilitate for a program like that, what's happened for me at different times commercially has allowed me to motivate the asks, which have allowed me to gather the funds to facilitate a program like this. So I think a lot of times our natural inclination is to imagine that these invested funds are this kind of intervention of these resourced people creates an inherent problematic position for artists and for arts workers. But if we pivot to being more thoughtful in how we poach these resources, I think we can actually use it more effectively. And I think you see that along the lines of how institutions are trying to kind of take in these resources and these wealth sources, and then kind of distribute them out as kind of cultural tools. And then how artists are starting to navigate or better understand how to take in these resources, redistribute them, and be active in our ability to kind of ask and to create opportunities beyond the transaction or exchange, which to me is more or less, boring in nature.
Kofi Annan is the most famous kind of quote of on globalization is by Kofi Annan, who says, "Arguing against globalization is like arguing against gravity." I thought, is that true? And then I sort of, particularly in America right now, where a lot of exhibitions, particularly Arab voices, have been shut down, shut off, postponed, cancelled. And it made me think, maybe the idea of global dialogue is a myth or a mask, or certainly there's something deeply problematic in a kind of easy understanding of what global dialogue is. Maybe I can ask each of the panel to respond, not politically to the current times, but what are the questions that the current times bring up in terms of globalization and global dialogue?
I think I would just like to say we need to think about where this global conversation is happening, because this is a main, let's say main concern, right? The social media, and I think this is at the core. And then, of course, perhaps this is where the art and museums and the art, contemporary art, actually has an important role.
Yeah, I kind of want to go back to Glissant because we began with Glissant. And, you know, Edouard Glissant in our many conversations always said that we need, when I asked him exactly that question, Tom, he was always saying that, you know, we need the dialogue with others, and we need to sort of show that that dialogue makes us actually, you know, richer, makes our life more special, and that we do not have the fear that we would lose our identity through that dialogue, you know, and I think that is so important in relation to Glissant's work. Mantia Diawara has done a very beautiful film which has a lot to do with that question, where he basically spends time with Edouard Glissant and documents exactly that point.
Rashid?
I feel like land is becoming kind of an antiquated way of imagining local, in that we live in a world with so much ability to communicate via social media and other tools and other resources that we're really kind of creating echo chambers that are creating different kinds and versions of the local. And so there are these kind of groupings of like-minded folks in different spaces that are gathering in these different platforms. And that, for me, is becoming more a sense of these kind of chosen local spaces. And so there's ideas of nationality, national identity, which has been fraught and continue to be very dangerous ways to self-identify, I think are becoming deconstructed in ways that maybe we never expected. So I think we have to evolve this idea of what the global and local is. I mean, even these terms for a conversation like this have to be so much more rigorously unpacked. I mean, it's just wildly antiquated, the way that we're employing language up here. And I think all of us here on the panel recognize that. And I'm also positive that you guys recognize that we're almost sitting in this like archive of language. And so we need to kind of evolve our semiotic understanding of what it is we're talking about. But when I talk about local, I'm talking about kind of created spaces, not landlocked spaces. So local isn't Qatar for me, right? Local is like-minded, local is connected, and local is narrative driven. And when I talk about global, I don't talk about global because I'm not positive I even understand what that means anymore.
Well,
yeah, okay, so sort of optimistic actually. I try to see this idea of going back since Okwi, for example, Okwi Unwezer made his documenta, and I was always thinking how the way he was like really presenting, okay, outside to the center, let's say, that was more into the idea of presenting, if I say us, as in the form of documentary. And I think that was also always for me a question, because I always felt that it's not enough to be presented, because in order for me to escape the idea of being exotic, it's much easier to be presented in the form of documentary. And I always questioning this idea that I felt that, but why it's not more processed? Why it's only I have to put it in this format? And I think it developed a lot now. I don't know if this is clear, but I really think within this 20 years, it's becoming, yes, I see art from all over the world, and it's becoming more realistic for everyone. So,
yeah, I mean, Okwi, I think it was 2002, documented 11, he kind of identified this term nearness as relevant. I think maybe, and I was thinking about that, and I think Rashid is probably right that we need to find new terms and new ways of articulating what is happening in our world. I want to thank everyone. I know that Zeina has to rush off, so we're going to close the panel here. She's going to finish up the Jerome exhibition that will open tonight, so I hope you'll all see that. I hope you'll all come to Village of the Sun and bask in the sun under the sundial at Old Airport Park. It's very close. We'll open that shortly. And I want to thank the panelists. I wasn't expecting this panel to be so optimistic and positive, but what a wonderful way to start the day. Thank you, Rashid, Hans, Zeina, and Wael. Thank you.